Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Church is Stupid.
Come a butt.
I'm Andy.
I'm Ruth.
I'm Elijah.
And last week we started the conversation about what it means for different denominations and, our history and looking at a lot of historical elements, which is quite fun if I have to say so myself.
Thank you.
I
thought I'd make it awkward for everybody. You're welcome.
The episode that it makes me think of is just our first episode.
Yeah.
And talking about pews, because we had a lot of information and a lot of history to that, and I thought that was pretty great. But for that, we started the conversation at the end of this upcoming possibility of a split in the United Methodist Church, and avoiding the subject of what it's actually on, because that's a conversation that we're going to be looking at possibly in the future, possibly at some other point. Actually looking at what it systematically means for a split to happen, in the church, in the current age, what it would mean if the United Methodist Church were to split.
Yeah. So, I'm sorry, I took that as my cue. Was that my cue?
I mean, it was your cue. Was your cue for anybody else but me to start talking?
Okay, it sounded like it, but I was just making sure. And it's not just the United Methodist Church, but I think from a broader perspective, what are the points in which you do part ways?
Yeah.
And biblically, there is some stance for that. One of the biggest splits or parting of ways that we see is between Paul and Barnabas. And Paul and Barnabas were really, really close and ministered together for a long time. But at a certain point, they realized that they would do more harm by being together than separating. Mm-hmm. And they still left in good faith, but they did go separate ways. And at least I think it was Barnabas. If it's not, this is going to be really embarrassing. I should have looked that up before I started talking.
Yeah, just confirmed your facts before anything happens.
It's okay. Elijah, are you fact-checking me?
Sure, I will try my best.
I appreciate it. But anyhow, sorry, sometimes I...
Well, no, I get it. You don't want to say something incorrect. Yeah.
Paul and Barnabas, I think.
Okay, it was them. Thank you. That's good, because I was going to be super embarrassed, especially because in college, I actually gave Elijah the nickname Barbie based on Barnabas, just for the record.
That's right.
So
Okay.
Elijah's name is still Barbie in my phone when he calls me, and we've been married for almost 4 years. How long have we been married? I don't know. I have him on another research task. Anyhow.
I think it was Barnabas. Yeah, the separation of Paul and Barnabas, ChristianCourier.com. There was a sharp contention that developed between them in Acts 15:36 through 41. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Spent too much time on that, but yes.
That's it. No, that was perfect. I appreciate it, because nothing would make me feel worse than if it was some other person.
Because then I saw something else that was talking about disagreements between Paul and Peter or something. I don't think that was the same thing.
No, they didn't. Yeah, they had their own disagreements, but Paul was kind of an angsty man, but that's okay.
Anywho.
Regardless, I think there is support for, at certain points, working together does more harm than it does good. But getting to that point and knowing when you're at that point is something that I think churches have struggled with for a really, really long time. Again, we see churches who will split over matters of opinion that really just ultimately are why? Why did you split over this? And we see people who take their opinions as dogmas, and that's why they feel like they need to split over them. But for me, a lot of it comes down to a practical side, which is, again, are you doing more harm than good by staying together? And asking that question. So has your mission, has your vision shifted from Christ onto being right about these things? I think at that point, when that's blinding your vision, there's an issue. And maybe that issue needs to be sorted through that. You need to talk that through, see if there's a point where you can come to some sort of compromise. And if not, then you have to healthily split. Mm-hmm. And in doing so, you need to, I think to do it in a Christian way is to acknowledge that it's happening, acknowledge that you've come to this point, but still acknowledge the good faith between you and that the mission goes on even past this. So particularly this becomes true when it is arguments about praxis. So praxis is the practice, essentially. So how it's lived out. There are some theologies that would, when they are acted out in the Christian faith, are in complete contradiction to the opposite side, right?
Yeah.
The opposite theology. And so at that point, how do you work together when there is no compromise, right? You can't find a compromise in that situation. And I think those are really the ones that we have to look at seriously and say, okay, maybe it's time for us to split, because if we can't practice together, then we can't run a organization together. Is that fair to say?
Do you have any, forgive me for asking this, Ruth, but do you have a specific example of such an event or such a split?
Sure. In the United Methodist Church, we're splitting over the theology of homosexuality and how that is lived out. I mean, and so for people who lean progressive, for the progressive side, then obviously to restrict somebody who is in a practicing homosexual relationship is antithetical to the gospel, right? Because it's not a sin, it's not wrong, therefore it would make no sense, and it would be incredibly wrong to restrict someone from becoming a pastor, restrict someone from getting married. From the more conservative side of that theology, from a practical standpoint, how can you serve with somebody you think is living in sin, right? How can you, or actively, how can you, how do you work together, right? Like, so in theory, at that point, there's so much contention because you have a difference of sin, what is not sin, what is this, what is that, that working together from a very practical level just doesn't always work. Okay. You know what I mean? Because if you have a pastor over here who is in a practicing relationship, and then you have a pastor over here who's conservative and doesn't acknowledge that this person's even a pastor, but they're serving the same organization. Yeah, right. That just doesn't really work. Yeah, it just on a very practical level. Yeah. So regardless, it's just one of those issues that it's like, how you can't work together. Like, at least I think there might be ways, and there are people who fall in the middle of those. So I'm just taking the extremes from both sides. Yeah, so of course. Please understand that I'm just talking about extremes and examples. Examples. Of what is a practical disagreement. If we want to go to history of practical disagreements, we can talk about the open table, right, for communion. Okay. So an open table means that all who have confessed who Jesus Christ is and have repented of their sins can come forward and partake in communion. That means children can. That means adults can. That means you walk into the church building, you're a member of any other church, you're welcome to. You're not a member of the church, you're welcome to. Yeah. Whatever. Whereas a closed table for communion says you have to be a member of this organization or church or whatever to partake in the communion or the Eucharist feast. Yeah. So,
and at that point, it's not just difference of opinion or difference of what you believe theologically,
but it's a difference of practice.
But the specific beliefs would interfere with how you practice faith.
Exactly. Because if you go to a closed, like if you serve at a closed table church as a minister, then somebody walks in and you offer them communion, then you have gone against your organization. Yeah. And vice versa. If you have an open table and you believe it should be closed and you deny someone communion, then you have gone once again against your organization. Yeah. So from a practical level, that's where we see it in history as well, of things that have divided the church previously. And so again, that's not, that's just, those are the extremes on both sides.
Right now you're defining what it looks like or what it means and like why they happen and the different reasons, I think. And not even just trying to argue about it, you're just defining
Yeah.
what what has happened and what is happening, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I see.
And so those are practical splits.
Yeah.
In my head, where things, if you spend all your time fighting about either of those issues, then you're completely distracted from the mission of Christ.
Yeah.
And that's not to say they weren't important conversations. They are important
Yeah.
conversations and need to happen. But from a practical level, if you're never able to resolve that,
Yeah.
then going
yeah.
your separate ways can be more healthy.
Going back, yeah, there we go, to the question of kind of what you were saying, Andy, like when or at what point is a split considered like necessary and helpful for the body of Christ, and when is a split not helpful, I guess, or not necessary.
Yeah.
Well, and it's important to note again, these are strictly my opinions on when a split is healthy or not healthy, because I think there's a lot of room for healthy conversation and for really studying scripturally, studying, there's a lot of room for us to talk and to compromise and to figure things out. But when that can't happen anymore, when those conversations have happened, or when people are refusing to allow those conversations to happen, it's healthier for everyone, I think, in those cases to say, we can't function as an organization together, but we can still acknowledge each other's Christianhood.
Hopefully, ideally, right?
That's a healthy split is acknowledging, again, that it is a split in theology.
Yeah. It's a tough thing to define and talk about, right? I mean, I know a lot of people who, I don't know. It's really easy to kind of look at all the different denominations that exist, like today, and to just sort of throw this blanket over it and say, man, all these denominations should never have existed. Everything should always just be one body for Christ. And ideally, maybe, like in a perfect world sort of a thing. Maybe like a single body of Christ who's all uniform in their beliefs. But then also you have to, I think if you get too caught up in that way of thinking, you tend to forget that you're as much of a part of history as all the generations before you are, because it's really easy to sort of view yourself as like the protagonist of the world and look at everything that's happened before, like that's history, but right now, like it's not. So then you have to kind of go back to every single example of like a church splitting, and you kind of have to chalk all that up as unnecessary. But I think if you've kind of examined the history of the church, during the Reformation times and before, I don't really know how you could, look at Martin Luther and say, you deciding to do this this is stupid. The church shouldn't have split there. Because I think most of us agree that the Reformation needed to happen, right?
Well, and even the Reformation eventually spurred a reformation within the Catholic Church as well.
Yeah.
So it's not like it only impacted the Protestant Church.
Right.
It also caused, which the original intention of that was to cause reformation, which is why it's called the Reformation, not to cause a split.
Yeah. So it can be, I think it can be really daunting to try to learn everything about church history and all these different denominations and all the history behind them. But I don't think that you're really doing anyone any favors by just saying all these denominations are stupid. It's all stupid. Splits should never happen. Like everyone should believe what I believe. Because at the end of the day, I think a lot of people who kind of get really entrenched in that sort of belief end up falling back on sort of that idea, because then you're still believing that what you believe is 100% the right thing, is 100% dogma. When at the end of the day, there's a million people, and there were millions and whatever, tons of people like you who were thinking the same thing back in the day, who didn't like what they were a part of,
Well, and it's very humbling, I think, to acknowledge the fact that, yes, I have reasons behind the theologies that I believe and I adhere to, but so do other people.
Yeah.
And just because we disagree doesn't necessarily mean, like, I'm not going to be 100% right. As much as I think I'm 100% right, it is ignorant, I think, to believe that I am 100% right.
Yeah.
That's how I personally believe, which is maybe silly, but I think it is humbling to realize that even to have your theology change, or to realize a place where you've been wrong. And I do want to just clarify something that I said again, because I don't want to be misunderstood. There are some splits that are dogma splits, and those do happen. And at that point, that is a split of actually, like, not all splits are. You're able to say, like, oh, hey, this is still a Christian split. No, there are certainly ones where they are issue of dogma, but we do need to know the difference between them.
Yeah.
I think that I just wanted to clarify that, because that's not fair to say all of them are only theological or opinion based.
I think through history you'll find some sort of split within the church from wherever it happened for any reason if you look hard enough.
Yeah.
And if you zoom in close enough and acknowledge, like, even little movements that split, you could find, I'm sure you could find any example for any reason, right? So
Well, I did look it up, and there's arguments over how many different denominations there are.
But
like some things I said 33,000, some said 45,000. Suffice it to say, there's a lot.
Yeah.
A lot of denominations.
So, one a little bit more hopefully interesting thought that I've had during this is we talked a lot about division, but what would it look like for collision? I'm saying collision as in churches recombining into one,
Merging?
which merges. And I'm not
Okay, that makes more sense.
I was
Sorry.
like,
'Cause collision sounds
Collision,
like clashing,
yeah.
but
like, whoa.
conflict,
but
right?
I saw what you meant. Like, they're
not conflict, but like peaceably coming back together. There's at least like on the internet, and so this could not be completely true because I haven't like done enough research into
Internet research is dogma. No.
Yep.
All right.
No.
There is about during the Reformation, there is a merging of several different churches into the Eastern Rites Roman Catholic, which is the Western Rites, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Oriental Orthodox Church, and the Assyrian Orthodox Church, all merge to form the Eastern Rites of the Roman Catholicism, which, again, I don't know enough to like give information on this, but it's like evidence that before churches have come together. It hasn't ended those Orthodox churches. They all still are apart. But like parts of them have come together. And so like my specific example, like I know we are not perfect on like theology and all that kind of conversation, but it's like the information that I know. The United Methodist Church and the Free United Methodist Church. The issue that caused the separation, like it's not the only issue, but it's become a non-issue at this point. And so that would be like the pews. And so say that's the only separation thing that like keeps them separated. That issue is now gone in the United Methodist Church. So would looking at like emergence, do you guys think that could ever be a possibility?
So that's really funny as you sit in a denomination that was based in a merger that happened in 1960, whatever. Because our church is a merger.
Yeah.
We were, I believe, I'd have to check, but I believe the Free Methodist denomination actually separated from the Methodist denomination. The United Methodist denomination came from a merger of the EUB Church and the Methodist, was it Methodist Episcopal? Gosh, my history is probably real bad. But anyhow,
things aren't as simple as they seem.
They merged to become the United Methodist. And that's how our denomination was formed. And it is relatively recent, I would say, since it was in the 60s. And so we have seen that. And even now we're seeing, I think within the Catholic Church, there's been a few different sects of churches that have been accepted as being under the Roman Catholic umbrella that previously were not. And that's been in the past like 10 years or so.
Wow.
So I think we do see those. I see them happening. One of the movements I think that, again, I've talked about this before, is the ecumenical movements, which is seeking to get churches together to do more work. And so they're able to maintain their individuality of denomination, but still work together.
That's a good example, because it's not. It doesn't even necessarily have to be like a denomination, like formally, coming together to merge, maybe necessarily into one denomination together, but even just like working together towards like the same common goal while acknowledging your individuality, like in your own denomination. Like I like that example a lot, because like you were saying before, like we've seen the other side recently where different denominations have literally merged, into a larger group. But I like that it doesn't always necessarily look like that. Ecumenical stuff, I think, is really, really cool.
And so going back to this point, and I know like we've talked about like they do happen, mergers, but if you were to take all of the churches and put them back into one.
You're really, really just like wanting to just slam everything back together, aren't you?
Yes. And that mostly comes from this idea of, and I don't know how to describe it without causing offense, because a lot of churches use this, but the one church concept. Where it's this idea that we are all one church. We are all United Methodists. We are all Methodists. We are all, end your phrase there, we are all Christians. We're all Christians, but we aren't the same. And so we're the same under our, if I understand our conversation, we're the same under our dogma, but our theologies and our opinions are what separate us. And I understand opinions like causing issues, because opinions will always cause issues. But how do we look at, and this is 100% going to spark something, how do we look at one book of the Bible and disagree so much about everything that's in it? And yet have it be our like defining thing.
Right.
As Christians, like, take the cross symbol out of the way. Our most defining thing is the Bible. It is the most stolen book in the world. It is like so many different things that you attribute to the Bible. It is our governing everything. It is our governing. It is like, it is where we find our God. And yet we disagree so much about it.
Well, and which translation?
Yeah.
You can even start there. I mean, we talked about some of that last week. I mean, you're right. Like, it's everything that we practically know about our faith or talk about our faith comes from this book called the Bible. I mean, which version?
Yeah. And so, like,
from who?
It's just my thought that, like, we divide ourselves so that we feel better about our own beliefs. But is that Christian? I like, you can argue, yes, it is Christian because of ... But we're called to like celebrate with our brothers and sisters, and yet we divide ourselves so much into these different categories of what is our brothers and sisters that I think sometimes the mission of like what we're given gets lost. And it would be horrible to take all the churches and just mash them all together and be like, you are just the church, because there'd be so many differences in theology and all this kind of stuff. But I think this conversation of separating ourselves into different denominations is detrimental to our mission.
So
I think it can be detrimental, but it isn't always, because then, I mean, you have to go back. You have to look at some of the things. I mean, the easy example of all time was the Roman Catholic Church doing the right thing, doing the Christian thing by selling indulgences and encouraging people to give them money to then give them permission to basically do things that were completely against the gospel. Was it right for them to do A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever? And if your answer is no, then you can't necessarily always just fall back on, well, we shouldn't be in different denominations because that isn't Christian. Because I don't know. Not every example of splitting is like a petty one.
No, yeah, of course.
I think that you could probably make the argument that nowadays, like, there are a lot of more petty splits than there are maybe major ones. I don't know if you could fully actually support it, but I think you can make the argument just from looking at things. But like, I think it's pretty easy to say that, like we were saying before, that some sort of split needed to happen back then. So I don't really know if you can just say in general that it's unchristian to be divided in certain ways now, because I mean, at least me personally, and granted, me not the most educated in church history, but still, I would probably make the argument that it wasn't right for a lot of the things that the Holy Roman Catholic Church was doing back in the day. I would consider a lot of things they were doing very antithetical to the Christian Bible, at least the way that I interpret it now. So I would think that back then, splitting would have been the Christian thing to do, to make a statement against it and to push for, better acts and better teachings.
Yeah.
So to say that, I mean, I don't know. I don't really know if I can say that that being separated in any way is immediately an unchristian thing. I think, unfortunately, you have to really look at every example and kind of determine it for yourself. I think ideally it would be great if everyone agreed, and if we really all did work together. I just don't know if the fact that we don't means that every example of why we don't is bad, I guess. I don't know how else to say it. I don't know. Maybe, Ruth, if you could maybe make more clarity out of that.
So for me, it's a lot like when you walk into an art gallery and you look at a painting.
Ooh.
Are you all going to see the same thing? Thanks, Elijah.
Yeah, sorry.
All right, you're not all going to see the same thing.
Yeah.
Does that mean that everyone needs to be thrown out? No. The artist...
If you're the photographer, maybe.
Right. Well, the artist probably had something in mind, right? So arguably there's something that was intended. And so some people might be closer, some people might be further away. I think those are fair observations.
Yeah.
But I think when it comes to denominations, we have a really big problem with forgetting that there's a reason why we still call each other Christians. That is the umbrella. That's the umbrella that we fall under. And so, yes, there's a lot of different ways that that's lived out, and people do treat them like they're not Christian. And I think that we see that across the board in different denominations that will look at other denominations and say, oh, that's definitely not Christian over things that aren't. But I think that one church mentality is actually kind of lived out in a way through the different denominations, as long as they continue to acknowledge the other denominations are Christian. As long as we continue to say, okay, this is dogma, this is Christian, then living it out, we can say, okay, because if we can do that with a single piece of art hanging on a wall in a gallery, if we can do that with a book that is 88 pages long, if we can do that with that, how much more can we do that with a document that was written in a completely different context than where we live now, in a different timeline? it's going to happen. You're going to look at it with different eyes. And there's a beauty to that. I think there's so much beauty that these denominations bring out in each other. You know, we look at the Catholic Church has such great reverence. Man, they revere God. And that's beautiful. We look at the movement of the more charismatic churches. And man, they're on fire for the Spirit. So cool to watch. We look at the movements of being friends with God, that whole mentality. And I think it's all part of the picture. It's all part of the picture of what makes a Christian, of that Christian walk. And when we focus on all of these things that make us worse or better than any other denomination, we've already started wrong. We're already in the wrong spot.
Yeah.
So instead of looking at these denominations as restrictions, as things that, well, I don't agree with you here, I don't agree with you here, we need to start looking at the things like the word Christianity. What does that mean? What is the dogma that unifies us? And not seeing those differences of theology as adverse or contradictions to that message, but as part of building a fuller picture. So to me, having these denominations, having these different interpretations doesn't necessarily work against the gospel message. I think it's the gospel message lived out that we can all still look at each other and say, you are my Christian brother and sister. That's the Christian message. It's not, well, we're just going to go along with it for the sake of unity because that's what we're supposed to do as Christians. But it's owning that sometimes you can't, or sometimes you just have different beliefs. And over here you can be with people who you agree with and identify with and see God through. And that there are other groups that see God in different ways than you. And that's okay. Is that fair?
I think it's a pretty good answer.
I think it's the ideal state of Christianity. At least nowadays,
it's
right?
It's the ideal, and I know that that's not how it's
the
always
perfect
lived
world.
out.
Yeah.
I know that people still squabble, people still only see the differences, but to me, that umbrella already exists. And we are all one church. But I know that not everyone sees it the same way.
So we are out of time,
Yes.
a little bit over. So I think I'm going to invite everybody this week to take some time and enjoy your umbrella. Learn a little bit of information about your, overarching everything. And if you feel inclined to do so, feel free to share it with us on our Facebook page or our Instagram or our Twitter. We're happy to hear whatever you guys have to say. And so for all of us here at Church of Stupid,
Come a butt.
I'm Andy.
I'm Ruth.
I'm Elijah.
And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your week.